Effective tonight, the board will assess Mr. Renner a continuing fine of $50 for every hour his commercial vehicle remains visible from any common road until the nuisance is permanently abated. That was Diane Halsey, president of the Cedar Bluff Owners Association, for 9 years running, reading from a single sheet of paper at a Tuesday night meeting. Her voice, pitched for the room. The vehicle she meant was my work truck, parked on my own gravel on the 11 acres my family has held since before her subdivision had a name. $50 an hour, $1,200 a day. She said it the way a person says a number they are certain you cannot pay. What Diane did not know, what she never once thought to check in the 4 years she spent escalating against me, was that the building she held those votes in did not belong to the association the way she believed it did. The deed to that meeting hall ran back through a chain she had never read. And I had read it. I read it before she ever sent the first letter, because reading the paper before you act on it is the only habit my father ever insisted I keep. So here is the question I want you to sit with. The same one I sat with on that gravel drive while the porch light buzzed and my daughter watched through the screen door. When someone with a clipboard decides to bill you by the hour for living on your own land, do you argue with them in a room they control, or do you go quiet and go find out who really owns the room? I will tell you what I did. Stay with me. My name is Walter Renner. I am 61 years old, and for 34 of those years I built and inspected steel and concrete for a living, which is a polite way of saying I spent my career being paid to find the one flaw other people swore was not there. I read drawings. I read soil reports, read the small print on the bottom of a permit while the contractor tapped his boot and waited. When I retired, I did not stop reading. I just turned the habit on my own paperwork and on the place I had spent my whole life calling home. The place is 11 acres at the foot of Cedar Bluff, in the high country, where the pasture gives way to pine and the creek runs cold even in August. My grandfather bought the parcel in 1946 with mustering out pay and a handshake, and he recorded the deed himself at the county seat, because he did not trust anyone else to do it right. I have the original. It is brittle now, the ink gone, the color of weak coffee, and in the bottom corner, there is a coffee ring where he set his cup down at the recorder's counter, because the story in our family is that he made the clerk wait while he read every line of it twice before he signed. That ring is on the most important piece of paper my family owns, and I have always thought it was the whole man in one stain. Measure twice, read twice, then sign. My father kept the same habit. He built the shop with his own hands in 1970, poured the slab himself, and he hung the gate the year after. And he kept a green metal cabinet in the corner of that shop where every paper that ever touched the land went to live. Tax receipts, the well permit, the letter from the power company, the year they ran the line up the draw. When I was a boy, I thought the cabinet was the most boring object in the world. I understand now, it was the spine of everything. When my wife Carol and I took the place over, we kept the cabinet and we kept the habit. Carol used to tease me that I filed a grocery list like it was going to be subpoenaed. She passed 4 years ago this spring, in the front bedroom that looks out at the bluff, with the window open so she could hear the creek. And the last clear thing she asked me was to keep the land whole for our girl. I told her I would. I have spent 4 years keeping that one short promise, and most of those years I did it with a folder. Our girl is Maddie. She is 16 now. She was 12 when her mother died, and she has lived with me on those 11 acres every day since, and she has her mother's habit of noticing the thing in a room that nobody else has clocked yet. The subdivision came later. In the early 2000s, a developer carved 160 lots out of the old Mercer Ranch that bordered us on the south and called it Cedar Bluff Estates, and stood up an owners association to run it. That association has a charter and bylaws and a meeting hall and a president who came to believe, somewhere along the way, that the green sign at the entrance gave her authority over everything she could see from the road. My 11 acres are not in Cedar Bluff Estates. They never were. My grandfather's parcel predates the subdivision by more than 50 years. The plat that created those 160 lots drew its northern boundary along my fence line and stopped. I am not a member. I never signed anything. I have never owed that association $1. The first letter came on a Monday in the spring, 4 years back, a few weeks after Carol's funeral. It was printed on association letterhead, and it informed me that my property was, in their words, functionally part of the Cedar Bluff community, and that as such, I was expected to bring my lot into conformance with community aesthetic standards. The specific offense was my truck, a 1-ton flatbed with a welder bolted to the back, and my old company name still faded on the door. It was parked where it had been parked for 20 years, beside the shop my father built. The letter gave me 30 days. I did not call them and shout. I have learned that shouting is a gift you hand the other side and they keep it. Instead, I did what my father taught me. Enda. I took a manila folder out of the green cabinet in the shop, and I wrote a date on the tab in pencil, the way he did, and I put the letter inside it. Then I drove to the county office and pulled my own deed and the recorded plat of Cedar Bluff Estates, and I laid them side by side on the kitchen table while Maddie did her homework across from me. She looked up from her algebra and asked what they were. I told her one was our land and one was the neighborhood that thought it owned our land, and I showed her where the line on the plat ran right along our fence and stopped. She studied it longer than a 12-year-old needed to. Then she said, "So, they're just wrong." I told her yes, but that being wrong had never once in human history stopped a certain kind of person, and she nodded like she already knew that and went back to her algebra. The plat boundary ran exactly along my fence. My parcel was not inside it. There was no annexation on record. There was no covenant touching my land. On paper, the association had no more authority over my truck than the man who reads the gas meter. I wrote one letter back. I kept it short, 3 sentences, no heat in it. I said I was not a member of the association, that my property was not within its recorded plat, and that I would appreciate no further correspondence on the matter. I signed it, made a copy on the old machine in the shop, and put the copy in the folder under the first letter. I drove the original to the post office and sent it certified, and I clipped the green return card to the copy when it came back, because my father taught me that a letter you cannot prove you sent is a letter you never sent. I thought that was the end of it. That is the thing about people like Diane. The fact that they are wrong is not information to them. It is an insult. The second letter came in July of that first year. It was a notice of violation, and it carried a fine, $200 for the same truck, with a line at the bottom, warning that fines would compound if the violation continued. I added it to the folder. By the end of that summer, there were 4 notices in there, and the tally on the bottom of the last one read $800. I had paid none of it. I had no reason to. Still, I noticed the number was climbing, and I noticed the language was getting bolder, and a man who spent his life reading for the hidden flaw learns to notice when a small thing is becoming a pattern. That fall, I drove down to the county sheriff's substation and sat across from a deputy named Cole. He was maybe 40, careful, the kind of man who reads a thing twice before he signs it. I set the folder on his desk and let him open it himself. He went through it slowly, page by page, the certified letters, the green return cards, the dated copies of my replies, and when he was done, he squared the pages and set his hands flat on top of them. When somebody files a complaint, we have to log it. Doesn't matter if it's nonsense. If they call us out here, we roll. That's the law, and I can't change it. He tapped the folder. But this is good. You keep doing exactly this. You build a record, every date, every letter, every call. If this ever turns into something real, the pattern is what wins it, not the shouting. The pattern. I asked him what he meant by something real. Trespass, he said. Damage. Somebody putting hands on your property without a right to. You get to a half-dozen documented incidents and a clear timeline. And now, it's not a neighbor squabble. Now, it's a case. I hope it doesn't get there. But if it does, you'll be the only one in the room with the paper. I drove home with that word in my head pattern. I started a second folder. It got there. Of course. The next spring, the third year of this, Diane found a new instrument. She had the association retain a man who called himself a compliance inspector. He had a clipboard and a laminated badge, on a lanyard and a polo shirt with the Cedar Bluff logo stitched on the chest, and he drove a small white sedan that scraped its belly on my cattle guard coming up the drive, which told me everything I needed to know about how often he left pavement. He came up my drive one Saturday morning while I was changing the oil in the truck, and he stood at the edge of my gravel in clean white sneakers and informed me he was there to conduct a compliance walkthrough of my property. I wiped my hands on a rag and asked to see his authority. He held up the badge on the lanyard like it answered the question. "Sir," he said, "the association has authorized a full exterior inspection. If you just let me document a few items, we can keep this simple." I told him the badge was a piece of plastic from a print shop. I told him he was standing on private land that was not in his association and never had been, and that the only thing he was authorized to do was turn his little car around. He did not turn around. He raised his phone and started taking photographs. The truck, the shop, the stack of steel I keep for projects, the new welder walking a slow line down my fence and narrating into his phone like a man reading a citation he had already written. I did not touch him. I did not raise my voice. I stood with the oil rag in my hand and let him finish, because a man documenting you is also documenting himself, and I wanted every frame of it. When he finally folded himself back into the white sedan, I noticed Maddie on the porch with her own phone up. She had filmed the whole thing, the badge, the sneakers, the photographs, the scrape of his car on the cattle guard going out. She had figured out before I had that the camera was part of the folder. Now that night she handed me the video, without my asking, and said, "I got the part where he says the association authorized it." She was 13. I have watched men twice her age miss the load-bearing sentence in a conversation. She caught it on the first take. That footage went onto 2 drives that night. One in the shop, one in the gun safe in the house. My father used to say a record you keep in only one place is a record you are planning to lose. I had 3 copies of everything by then, and a timeline written out in my own hand on a legal pad, and I had begun, slowly, to do the thing that would end all of this. I had begun to read, because somewhere in that 3rd year a question had lodged in me and would not come loose. Why? Why would a woman with 160 lots to manage spend 4 years, and the association's money, chasing one retired man's work truck on 11 acres she had no claim to? People are petty, but petty is cheap, and this was not cheap. This was lawyers and a retained inspector and certified letters and an abatement order drawn up like a real instrument. Somebody was spending real money and spending it steadily, the way you only spend on a thing that pays you back somewhere you are not pointing. In 34 years of finding the flaw nobody wanted found, I learned that the lie is rarely in the thing everyone is looking at. The lie is in the thing nobody thought to turn over. When somebody spends real money on something that makes no sense, it is because it makes sense for a reason they are not saying out loud. And the only way to find that reason is to stop watching the hand that is waving and go read the ledger. So I started reading about the association, not the bylaws. The money. The Cedar Bluff Owners Association meeting hall sits on a half-acre pad at the entrance to the subdivision, a tidy building with a peaked roof and a flagpole and a gravel lot. Every owner in those 160 lots pays dues, and a slice of those dues had been going for years toward what the budget called facilities and grounds. I am a man who reads budgets for entertainment, so I read this one. And the facilities line did not add up. The hall was paid for. The land under it was not. That was the loose thread, and I pulled it. I went back to the county office, the same counter where I had pulled my own deed, and I asked the clerk to walk the chain of title on the parcel under the meeting hall. The clerk was a woman named Ruth who had worked that counter long enough to remember my father, and when I told her what I wanted, she gave me the look clerks give you when you have asked for real work instead of a form. She pulled the books anyway. It took her the better part of an hour, 3 bound volumes and a microfilm reel and a lot of squinting, and twice she stopped and went back a page because the chain did not do what she expected. When she came back to the counter, she set it all down and tapped the last entry with one finger. "Walt," she said, "this is the strangest thing I've pulled in a month. That hall's been sitting there a dozen years, but the dirt under it never went to the association. It's still held by a company." She turned the book so I could read it. And they're paying that company a lease out of the dues. Year after year. She read the name on the lease aloud, slow, and then she looked up at me, because she had gotten there a half-second before I had. The half-acre that the Cedar Bluff Hall stood on had never been deeded to the association. The developer who built the subdivision had put the building up on a parcel he still personally controlled through a holding company, and the association had been paying that holding company a lease, year after year, buried in the facilities line, for the privilege of meeting in a hall the members thought they owned. And the developer who controlled that holding company, whose signature was on the lease, shared a last name with Diane. He was her husband, Gerald Halsey. I had Ruth print me certified copies of all of it, and I paid the $1 a page without blinking. And I drove out and sat in my truck, in the county lot, for a long time after that. Here is what I understood. Sitting there, Diane's husband owned the ground the association met on and collected a lease from the dues of the very people who elected his wife president. The fines, the inspectors, the pressure on the edges of the subdivision, none of it was really about my truck. It was about momentum. It was about an association president who needed to look strong and busy and in control, because as long as the members saw her fighting nuisances at the boundary, none of them looked too hard at the facilities line or asked why their dues went to a company with their president's name on it. I was not her enemy. I was her theater. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired and a little sick and very clear. I drove home and told Maddie only that I had found something at the county and that it was going to matter later. She did not ask what. She had learned, the way kids of careful people learn, that some things go in the folder before they get said out loud. The 4th year is when it crossed the line, with the It was a Tuesday in June, late afternoon, the lights still high over the bluff. I had driven down to the feed store for a sack of mineral and left Maddie home with the dog, an old blue heeler named Scout, who has slept on the shop porch every night of his life and barks at exactly two things, the propane truck and strangers. When I pulled back up my drive, he was barking at strangers. There was a flatbed contractor truck parked across my gate, blocking it, and two men in work clothes were standing at my fence line, and one of them had a pair of bolt cutters, and my gate, the one my father hung in 1971, was hanging open with its chain cut and lying in the gravel like something shot. Maddie was on the porch, with her fist wrapped in Scout's collar, holding him back in her face, when she turned to look at me as a thing I will not forget. She was not crying. She was furious. And underneath the fury, she was scared, and she was holding the dog with one hand and her phone with the other. I got out slow. I keep my voice level when my heart is going. That is a thing the trade taught me. You do not let the crew see you rattled, because the crew takes its temperature from you. I walked up and asked the men what they thought they were doing on my land. The older one, gray-bearded, uncomfortable, held up a paper. "We got an order," he said. "Abatement. Removing an obstruction off a community easement." We were told this was all signed off. I asked to read it. He let me. It was an abatement order on association letterhead, with Diane Halsey's signature at the bottom, authorizing the removal of an unpermitted gate, obstructing what the order called a community access easement. There is no community access easement across my land. There never has been, not in 1946, not in any document recorded since. They had cut my gate on the authority of a paper Diane wrote herself, granting her own association a right-of-way that exists nowhere in the records I had spent a year reading. I handed the paper back. I told the older man, calm as I could manage with Maddie watching, that the order was worthless, that the easement on it did not exist, and that the two of them were standing on private property they had just destroyed a gate to enter. I told him I had already called the sheriff. Maddie had, in fact, called the second. She saw the bolt cutters come out, and she had filmed all of it from the porch, the truck across the gate, the cut chain in the gravel, the paper in the man's hand. The older man looked at the order in his hand, and then at the cut chain, and then at the teenage girl on the porch with a phone pointed at him, and I watched something in his face go from routine to sick. He had been told this was a permit job. He was beginning to understand it was a crime, and that it was on video. "Mister," he said quietly, "if this ain't square, we're done. We don't do that kind of work." He set the bolt cutters down in the bed of his truck like they had gotten heavy. Deputy Cole rolled up the drive 11 minutes later. He took one look at the cut chain, the contractor truck across a private gate, and the abatement order, the man's hand, and he asked me a single question. He asked if I still had the folder. I had the folder. I want to slow down here, because this is the part that matters, and I have learned that the parts that matter do not happen fast, they happen quiet. Cole did not arrest anyone in my driveway. He took the abatement order and read it twice, and he asked the contractor who had hired him, and the man gave the association's name and Diane's name, and Cole wrote it down. He photographed the gate. He took Maddie's statement, gentle with her, and took mine. Then he told the contractors to move their truck off my gate, and not to touch one more thing on the property. And they did, fast, because the older one had finally read the room. Before Cole left, he stood with me by the cut chain, and he said low, "This is the one. This is the documented incident that makes it a case. You bring me that folder and the timeline tomorrow morning, and we are going to the county with it." We did not go to the county the next morning. We went to the meeting hall. that part is getting ahead of itself. Because here is what I had been building toward quietly through that whole 4th year while Diane escalated and I filed. When I learned that her husband's holding company owned the ground under the hall and leased it back to the association, I learned something else. I learned that the holding company was carrying debt on that parcel, an old construction note from the subdivision build that had never been cleared, and that the note was in default, and that the lender had moved to sell the parcel to recover. The ground under the Cedar Bluff meeting hall was in plain terms for sale. Quietly. Through the lender. Most of the members had no idea, because the lease payment kept landing in the facilities line every year, and no one read the facilities line. No one but me. So I bought it. It took the better part of that year, and most of what Carol and I had set aside, and 2 trips to a title attorney in the county seat to make certain the chain was clean and the purchase would stand. Then, on a Friday in May of the 4th year, 3 weeks before Diane stood up and fined me $50 an hour, the deed to the half-acre parcel under the Cedar Bluff Owners Association meeting hall was recorded at the county in my name. Walter Renner. The same county counter where my grandfather recorded his parcel in 1946. I did not tell a soul outside the title office and Maddie. I put the recorded deed in the folder, on top, where my father would have put it. Diane did not know. She held her votes every month in a building that sat on ground I now owned. And on that Tuesday night, 3 weeks later, when she read out her $50 an hour fine to a room full of nodding members, she was standing on my land to do it. Which brings us back to where I started. The morning after they cut my gate, I called the association and asked to address the board at the next meeting. Diane's secretary put me on the agenda. I think because Diane wanted the room to watch her face me down. The meeting was the following Tuesday, in the hall, 7 o'clock. I brought the folder. I brought Maddie, who asked to come, and I did not say no, because she had earned the right to see how it ended. Deputy Cole came too, in plain clothes, and stood at the back, because he had asked to be there when the paper came out. The hall was full. Word had gotten around about the cut gate, and people are drawn to a fight. Diane sat at the center of the long table at the front, in a bright magenta blazer with the association pin on the lapel. And she let me stand at the little podium they keep for members. And she smiled at me the way you smile at someone you have already beaten. "Mr. Renner," she said for the room, "you have been a persistent problem for this community. Your property is functionally part of Cedar Bluff, whether your paperwork says so or not, and this board is prepared to enforce our standards until you comply. Now, you asked to speak. Speak. I have thought a great deal about why the quiet works, and I think it is this. A loud man can be dismissed as angry. A quiet man with a folder makes a room lean in. I said I had 3 documents I wanted entered into the record. I said the first was the recorded plat of Cedar Bluff Estates, showing the northern boundary running along my fence, with my 11 acres outside it. I laid it on the table. I said the second was my own deed, recorded in 1946, predating the subdivision by more than 50 years, showing no covenant, no annexation, and no easement touching my land. I laid it down beside the plat. Diane glanced at them and started to say something about functional community boundaries. And I said there was a third document. I said the third was the recorded deed to the parcel this hall is built on. I laid it on the table. I told the room, plainly, without heat, what it was. I said the ground under this building had never belonged to the association. I said it had been owned by a holding company and leased back to the members out of their own dues. and that the lease had been signed by the man who controlled the company, and I said his name, Gerald Halsey, and I let the room hear it next to the name on the table at the front. I said the holding company had defaulted on the note under this parcel, and the lender had moved to sell, and 3 weeks ago the parcel had been sold and recorded. I said the new owner's name was on the deed in front of them. And then I said the only hard thing I said all night, and I said it level, looking at the deed and not at her. You are holding this meeting in my building, I said, and I am revoking your association's tenancy effective now. The room did not erupt. That is not how it goes when the paper is real. The room went silent, the particular silence of 100 people doing arithmetic at once. Diane reached for the deed and read it. I watched her read it. I watched her read her husband's name on the lease history clipped behind it. She read it twice the way Cole reads things, and the blazer suddenly looked like a costume, which is what it had always been. She said the deed had to be fraudulent. She said it twice, louder the second time, looking around the room for someone to agree with her. And a few heads turned, because that is what a room does. It waits to see who is going to be right before it decides what it thinks. Cole stepped up from the back then. He showed his badge, unhurried, and he said quietly that he had been with me at the county counter himself, that he had watched the clerk pull the chain, and that the title was clean and recorded, and not in any dispute. Then he said the matter the sheriff's office was actually interested in tonight was not the deed at all. It was the cut gate and the abatement order she had signed for an easement that did not exist, that had sent 2 men with bolt cutters onto private land where a 16-year-old girl was home alone. He said the word she had used in her own order, abatement, and then he said a different word down next to it. Criminal trespass. Destruction of property. He said there would also be questions, separate questions, about association funds spent for 4 years pursuing a parcel the association had no jurisdiction over, and about who those funds had ultimately been paying. He did not look at Gerald when he said it. He did not have to. Gerald was already looking at the door. Here are the 2 numbers I want you to hold the way I have held them. In 4 years, Diane Halsey's association had assessed against me a running total of fines that, with her $50 an hour escalation, was designed to climb past $100,000 inside the first 3 months. I had paid 0. Not $1 had I ever owed, and not $1 had I ever paid. And the deed under her feet, the one that ended it, was the same kind of recorded county paper my grandfather had filed in 1946, 79 years before, the year a returning soldier decided to do a thing right and write it down. $0 paid. 79 years of clean record. That was the whole case. It had been sitting in the folder the entire time, and the costume at the front of the room had never once thought to ask what was in it. I gathered my 3 documents off the table, slid them back into the folder, and sat down next to my daughter. The meeting did not really continue after that. People do not have much appetite for the rest of the agenda. Once they have watched the floor open up under the front table, the consequences fell where they were always going to fall, on the scheme, and not on the misled. Word of the lease moved through the subdivision faster than any letter ever had. Once the members understood that their dues had been paying a lease to their own president's husband, for ground he was about to lose to a defaulted note, the mood turned the way it turns when people who trusted a thing realized they were the product. They called an emergency meeting in a school gymnasium because they no longer had a hall to meet in, and a retired bookkeeper 2 streets over stood up and asked, out loud, to see 4 years of the facilities line, and that single request did more damage than anything I had brought to the podium. Diane Halsey resigned the presidency she had held for 9 years rather than face the recall vote that was already being organized on a clipboard, which I thought was a fitting instrument for it. Gerald Halsey's holding company, exposed and already in default, did not survive the year. The lender took the rest of what it held. The county opened an inquiry into the abatement order, and the association's spending, and the Cutgate matter went forward, as Cole said it would. With the gray-bearded contractor giving a statement of his own, because it turned out he had kept the work order he was handed, the way careful men do. Diane was not destroyed. I took no pleasure in any of it, and I want to be honest that there was less pleasure in it than you would think there would be. I had imagined, in the worst of the 4 years, that I would feel something like victory. What I felt was the quiet a shop gets when a loud machine finally shuts off. She lost, specifically and only, the thing she had spent 4 years trying to take. The authority she performed over my land turned out to rest on ground that was mine. And when the ground moved, the performance had nowhere to stand. I leased the hall back to the new association, the reformed one, for a fair $1 a year, on the single written condition that no fine, notice, or inspection ever again issue against any parcel outside the recorded plat. They signed it gladly. The folder has a copy. The gate my father hung in 1971. I repaired myself the following Saturday, with Maddie holding the post plumb while I reset the hinges and ran a new chain through it, heavier than the last, the kind you would need a cutting torch and an afternoon to get through. Scout supervised from the shade. When we finished, Maddie stood back in the gravel and looked at it a long moment, and said it looked the same as before. I told her it was supposed to. That was the whole point. That was the promise I made in the front bedroom with the window open, and a man keeps a promise like that the same way he keeps a deed, by writing it down where it cannot be argued with, and then living so the record holds. That evening, Maddie and I sat on the shop porch, with Scout stretched out between us, and watched the light go off the bluff the way Carol used to. The gold climbing the rock and then leaving it. Maddie was quiet for a while. Then she said she had been scared the day they cut the gate. More scared than she. Let me see, but that she had filmed it anyway, because she knew it was what I would want. I told her that her mother would have done the exact same thing, that filming it was braver than shouting at the men ever would have been, and that she should remember which of those two things ended up winning. She thought about that. Then she said, "The folder won," and I said, "Yes, the folder won," and we left it there. After a while, she went in to start dinner, and Scout got up stiff and followed her, and I sat a minute longer with a folder on my knee and the recorded deed on top of it, the new paper resting on the green return cards, on the dated letters, on 4 years of doing the boring thing on purpose. Now, let me step out of the story and tell you plainly what it taught me, because that is the part worth keeping. If somebody with a title and a clipboard tells you that you owe them, do not argue in the room they control, and do not pay $1 before you have read the paper. Go to the county. It is your right, and it is cheaper than a lawyer. Pull your own deed and read it against the recorded plat, and walk your boundary with the survey in your hand until the ground and the paper agree. Keep a folder. Date every letter, save every notice, photograph every incident, and keep your records in more than one place. Because a record you keep in only one place is a record you are planning to lose. Stay calm, because calm reads as guilt to a bully and as strength to a judge, and only one of those opinions ends up mattering. And learn, before you need to, who actually owns the room. Authority that cannot show you the deed is just a costume, and a costume comes off the moment the real paper hits the table. If you have your own story of a board, an association, or a clipboard that tried to bill you for living on your own land, put it in the comments. I read them, and you will not believe how many of you have one. If this is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe, because next week I am telling you about the rancher whose HOA tried to condemn his stock pond as a community water feature. Right up until he produced the federal water right his great-grandfather filed in 1902. Until then, walk your line, read your deed, and keep your folder. I will see you next time.